We have seen in the last 2 years many twists and turns, and we've also seen Russia being particularly good at hiding its own frailty. And Russia, people shouldn't understand, is frail. It has had to now rely, the great Putin has ended up going on bended knee to North Korea, a country that even Russia used to sort of effectively ignore, begging for its poor citizens who are now being used as cannon fodder. And Russia's economy, which is heavily now committed to just funding the war machine, is much more fragile than they would like you to think.
Good afternoon, I'm Andrew Neil. This is Times Radio. Nearly 1,000 days after Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, and President Biden is finally allowing Ukraine to use longer-range missiles to hit military targets inside Russia. US officials indicate that the change of heart came about because of the mass missile attack on Ukraine's critical infrastructure at the weekend, plus the deployment of 10,000 North Korean troops to be used as cannon fodder in Russia's bid to retake the Kursk region from Ukrainian forces. There's also a general sense that Mr. Biden feels the need to strengthen Ukraine's position as best he can before its fate is handed over to the uncertain hands of Donald Trump in January. Of course, if he'd acted much sooner, President Biden that is, Ukraine would not now be on the back foot, which it most certainly is. The use of longer-range US missiles to hit military targets inside Russia will concern the Kremlin, but it's not a game-changer. The White House has paved the way for British Storm Shadow missiles to be deployed too, though so far the UK government has had nothing to say about this. Mr. Trump's son, Donald Jr., not previously noted for his geopolitical insights, has accused Mr. Biden of trying to start World War III by allowing longer-range missiles to be deployed. Other Trumpers have been critical of his latest move too. The president-elect, of course, has said he will end the war in a day, without ever explaining how. His people leaked a recent phone call he had with President Putin, asking him not to escalate in Ukraine. The Russian dictator's response was to deploy North Korean troops and mount the weekend's missile barrage, suggesting peace might be rather more than 24 hours away when Mr. Trump returns to the Oval Office. The Kremlin wants Ukrainian troops out of Russia so parts of the Kursk don't become a trade for parts of Ukraine occupied by Russia in any peace deal. Talk of peace is in the air on both sides of the Atlantic, but as things stand, any peace deal looks like involving major sacrifices for Ukraine. At least the ability to use longer-range missiles strengthens Kyiv's hands. Mr. Trump shouldn't think of reversing that if he wants to achieve an even half-acceptable peace deal. This is Andrew Neil. You're listening to Times Radio. Let's speak now to Ben Wallace, who was Secretary of State for Defence when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Ben Wallace, thank you for joining us. Let's start with the overall state of the war as you see it. Would it be fair to describe Ukraine's current military position as somewhat bleak?
I think I would describe it as precarious rather than bleak. We have seen in the last 2 years many twists and turns, and we've also seen Russia being particularly good at hiding its own frailty. And Russia, people shouldn't understand, is frail. It has had to now rely, the great Putin has ended up going on bended knee to North Korea, a country that even Russia used to sort of effectively ignore, begging for its poor citizens who are now being used as cannon fodder. And Russia's economy, which is heavily now committed to just funding the war machine, is much more fragile than they would like you to think. So I think what I would say is it is precarious. There are, as ever with something like a war, there are very few decisions could turn the tide one way or the other. But Putin's single calculation he has left in his head is, I can lose more than anyone else, and the West will have no resolve. And I think what's been important about the announcement yesterday is, for now, and as you rightly said, Andrew, President Trump is on the horizon. The West is indicating that it is going to continue to support Ukraine, and it's not going to be bullied by Putin threats of escalation, which we've seen throughout this.
Will allowing Ukraine to use these longer-range missiles and they can strike, I think, up to about 200 miles inside Russia. Will it make much of a military difference?
It'll make a military difference to the sort of whatever offensive is underway. And I think this is the thing that listeners must take away or understand from this. When we talk about deep strike, there is, you know, these weapons, even the Storm Shadow, they are not going to be able to go deep into the heart of Russia and target Moscow or St. Petersburg or all the very major conurbations. These are weapons that go beyond the tactical and can reach into the logistical support, the headquarters or the ammo dumps, which are usually positioned anywhere between 50 and 300 kilometers away. And so, you know, Russia is busy out today. I've heard the ambassador and people like that on the airwaves telling you how this is a massive escalation and it's going to lead to World War III, and that somehow these weapons are posing a direct threat to the regime. Not at all. They couldn't these weapons bring down the Russian government or the regime. They are absolutely being deployed, as they have already been done in places like Crimea, to go after command and control, ammo dumps, and basically starve their front line of the support they need to prosecute this illegal war that they started and that they are engaged in.
Now that President Biden has given the go-ahead to use US ACTAMs, which I believe is the name for the kind of missiles that we're talking about, or the American version, I wouldn't have thought there was a reason why the UK Storm Shadow missiles, which you mentioned, and their French equivalents, which I think President Macron has said he would be prepared to deploy too, that they can't not now be deployed. And I would have thought they would have welcomed Mr. Biden's decision. So I'm slightly puzzled that we've had nothing but radio silence from London and Paris on this matter.
Well, the nature of many of these weapon systems is you really announce it by their use rather than trailing it in advance. You know,
Maybe Mr. Biden's kind of blown that.
Well, remember, he's talking about ATACMS, and ATACMS are different. They're delivered differently. The T in the ATACMS, it's Army Tactical, is a clue to their ranges. They're not strategic in weapon systems. They're tactical, but with a long range to reflect the modern battlefield. And of course, they're already deployed on the ground. So I think what we have done, certainly, and I did when I was Defence Secretary, is we didn't really herald their use. Before the invasion, we did publicly say we were putting in those very short-range anti-tank weapons. But now the best thing is to not let your enemy, or indeed your friend and ally, Ukraine's enemy, know when or where we're going to use these. But I would hope, and I expect they will be used. And we should also remember another line deployed by the Kremlin about Russia, you know, using these in Russia. You'll remember, Andrew, about a year ago, I think it was, the Russian parliament passed laws making parts of occupied Ukraine Russian territory. And legally, they view Crimea as Russia. I think Putin's phrase was Russia is Crimea and Crimea is Russia. Well, Storm Shadows have been used there for nearly over a year now. So Russian territory in the eyes of the Kremlin has already been hit by these weapon systems. And therefore, I don't think there's much of a dial difference other than we will be able to hit, or the Ukrainians, not the British, not the United States, but the Ukrainians will choose the targets and they will be able to hit the people prosecuting this illegal war.
If we add together the Storm Shadows, the French equivalent, the American equivalent, they're all longer range, but as you said, they're not by any means strategic missiles. Will there be enough of an arsenal of these missiles that Ukraine can do real damage to Russia's military infrastructure close to the Ukrainian border?
Not in the long term. And it's why I have, for some months, campaigned that Germany should unlock their Taurus weapon stocks. Taurus is a missile very similar to the French Scalp and the Storm Shadow. And even if you prohibited their Tauruses from being used on Russian territory, those big stocks that the Germans have, because they haven't been supplying them, would help very much in pushing back Russians within Ukraine. And I think I would call upon the Chancellor of Germany to now reconsider his rather stubborn and clumsy opposition to using Taurus, which just makes them sort of look odd compared to the French and the British, who've been using it for, as I said, over a year. And that would absolutely augment the fight in pushing Russians out of Ukraine, never mind striking targets in Russia. And I think that will give real stops. And we should all be now working to pressurize the German government to do it.
But you will know better than I that rather than unlocking the Taurus arsenal of German missiles, Chancellor Scholz, who is something now of a lame duck chancellor and faces elections he will almost certainly lose in February of next year, that rather than getting ready to hand over Taurus, he's decided instead to call President Putin on the phone for purposes I couldn't really quite divine. I wonder if you could.
Well, I described him as the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time about 6 months ago. He clearly doesn't understand deterrence. He doesn't understand how important an international sort of single voice is in deterring Putin. He doesn't understand you don't rule things out in deterrence. You remain ambiguous, even if you privately aren't going to do something. You keep your adversary guessing. He's done everything that you should do. He's done it wrong. He's ruled out using weapons, different types of weapons, and then either had to back down or he's let Putin back him in a corner. He rings President Putin for whatever reason, I don't know. Putin's response is, "Thank you very much. I'm now going to whack huge amounts of Ukrainian infrastructure," and Putin makes him look very foolish indeed. And I think lots of us will have a bit of a sigh of relief when these German elections are over. I hope whoever, it's not for me to tell Germans who to vote for, but I can tell you, I think Olaf Scholz is probably better suited to running a subcommittee of a planning committee in a local council than I think one of the biggest nations in Europe.
Well, we'll see if that's what he ends up doing. Ben Wallace, thank you for joining me on Times Radio today. That was the former Conservative Defence Secretary there, Ben Wallace. Now, coming up, Labour was swept to power in a landslide, but it hasn't quite got off to a flying start in government. It's already under siege on